Welcome everyone to this event. First, I just want to thank you for showing up. We are all like totally zoomed out these days, and I'm hoping this will kind of be a zoom in to something quite meaningful, and I'm very grateful that this is happening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Wapner, and I'm a professor of global environmental politics at American University. I also offer workshops at the Lama Foundation. And so just so you know, American University is in Washington, D.C. And the Lama Foundation is north of Taos, New Mexico. And Lama is it's an ecumenical intentional community, as well as a retreat center. And its mission really is twofold. One is to enhance consciousness and help us all awaken more to the worlds we're living in, as well as stewardship of the land. And so I thank Lama for hosting this, as well as American University. I also want to say that I'm basically zooming in from Taos, New Mexico, and Taos, I'm standing on occupied land. This land historically was inhabited and still is inhabited by the Red Willow people. And I'm living next to the Taos Pueblo, which has been here, which has been inhabited for over 1,000 years. So I feel quite profound to be my feet on the ground here. So tonight's talk is the second in a series of talks that revolve around the concept of contemplative environmentalism. And basically the assumption of this series, and it'll end with a workshop, is that environmental issues challenge us, not just our technological, economic, and political lives, but it also challenges us to think about what it means to be human, and what it means to be human in this moment of intense environmental intensification and searing injustice. And the series is aiming to explore then how do we hold ourselves, think, act, and so forth in this unique historical moment. I just want to say though, before we begin, that the next talk is a week from today. It's going to be on environmental activism, and we'll have Lila June and Bill McKibben on that event. And thanks, we're going to have put the links to both these in the chat. And then that weekend, we're going to host a weekend workshop on contemplative environmentalism, which will be a chance. It's going to be a very small group, and we're going to delve deeper into basically the relationship between our inner lives and environmental engagement. And actually, Lena Fletcher and I will be co-leading that, so I'm looking forward to that. But that's not why we're here tonight. We are here tonight because we're going to hold a session on, it's called Contemplative Environmentalism, Living Justice in an Unjust World. And so we're going to try to focus on this interface between environmental challenges and social justice. And I'm totally psyched to have two fabulous scholars, and not more importantly, but more importantly to me, and two friends to be part of this webinar. And so our panelists tonight, I'm going to start with Malini. This is Malini Ranganathan. And Malini is a colleague of mine at American University. She's an associate professor, as well as the interim faculty director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. Malini does many things. She's an expert in environmental justice. She's written a lot and teaches a lot within that general framework. But one important theme that she's been developing is looking at how caste and race and class, how they provide unequal access to basic needs, as well as how they render some people more vulnerable to environmental harm than others. She's published widely, and she is at work on a book called Urban Political Ecologies of Caste, Land, Labor, and Environmental Justice. And so Malini, I want to welcome you and thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul.
And then I would like to introduce Lena Fletcher. Lena Fletcher is a professor of environmental conservation at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Her work focuses on climate justice, environmental sociology, and contemplative pedagogy. And in this last dimension, she uses meditation and yoga, journaling, and other reflective practices to help her students enhance their learning and so forth. Lena and I have taught last year, a couple of years ago, we co-taught a workshop at Lama on contemplative environmentalism. And as I mentioned, she'll be joining me in about a week and a half to do it again online. So the format for today is going to be that I'm going to moderate the conversation. I'm going to ask a few questions, and Lena and Malini will respond as they see fit. You can also, Malini and Lena, I want to invite you to speak to each other. You could ignore me at those points. And then after a bit, I'm going to open it up to the question and answers session, and there's an icon at the bottom of your screens that says Q&A, and that's where it would be great to list your questions. Okay, and at the end, we'll finish with some final remarks. So, thank you both. So Malini, I'd love to turn to you first because you're my colleague. I could take advantage of you by asking to go first. Many listeners are not familiar with your work. And I wondered if you could just begin by giving us a sense of what you do, and further, if you could describe kind of fundamentally what animates you, what moves you to engage this kind of work.
Thank you so much to Paul. You've been such a friend, a colleague, and advisor to me over the last several years at AU. Thank you to the Lama Foundation for hosting this really thoughtful series. And thank you to Lena for being my fellow panelists. Perhaps most of all, thank you to the audience for joining in this conversation. Here in the East Coast, it's a late summer evening, and I really appreciate your time. So I think this question really solicits me telling you a little bit about my background and training. So I have a training and background in urban and human geography, post-colonial studies, and critical race theory. And at core, my work investigates urban environmental injustices, what I have been referring to more recently as environmental unfreedoms for their fundamentally dignity and life-robbing traits. And how environmental unfreedoms are structured by race, caste, and other intersectional axes of difference. I have engaged in long-term participant observation and ethnography and archival research, as well as scholar activism in both Bangalore and southern India and in Washington, DC, on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway Nation and the Anacostan and Nacotchtank Native Americans, from where I speak to you today, and sort of those longer durée histories of settler colonialism are very key in informing my understanding of environmental justice. So as mentioned, I'm interested in how historical and deeply racialized land, property, and housing regimes shape environmental harms today. So I make that connection between spatial inequity and environmental inequity. And those environmental harms that I think I've empirically tried to map and trace most are things like water access, which is important to keep in mind is also not one of those freedoms that's universally available to Americans, right? While we normally associate with the global south, we really have to remember that it's also, there are geographies of water inequity here too, but also sanitation, flood, and climate change vulnerability. So on the question of what really drives me, you know, first of all, I want to also bring it home to the space of the university, because having just concluded a one-year leadership position as faculty director of American University's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, I feel that so much of that work around justice starts very close to home. And so one goal of mine in my activism within the university has been to explicitly create community among Black and Brown faculty who feel quite alienated at a PWI, a predominantly white institution such as American. My work within the university aims to push the levers of power, to not dilute and corporatize diversity, equity, and inclusion, but to make good on their promises to diversify faculty and students, to deepen rigorous curricula on racial histories, colonialism, intersectionality, critical race theory, and to develop in students the art of self-reflexivity and humility. So I think what fundamentally moves me is a sort of ability to see some change in my most proximal surroundings, or to try to bring about change. But beyond that, what fundamentally moved me to do this work and the scholarship and scholar activism, and I've partaken in movements against land grabs, against the privatization of water in India, and also housing movements in the United States. What fundamentally moves me is I guess what you can call an internal compass that has in some ways always been oriented towards justice. From my earliest years when I lived in East Africa in the early 1980s, and I saw my father, then an Indian diplomat, coordinate food aid from India, a global South country that was on the heels of the Green Revolution, to a famine-stricken country in East Africa, namely Ethiopia, which is where I spent my younger years. And then what moves me too fundamentally is a lifelong pursuit of learning and unlearning. I do think my conception of justice has shifted from one of perhaps charity to more solidarity and humanism, which I'd love to revisit later in the comments. And finally, what moves me is to connect, and I think this relates to my last point, environmentalism with a radically re-envisioned and decolonial humanism. So there's this perception among mainstream environmentalists that the environment is about the non-human and biotic world, whereas humanism deals with the human condition, human flourishing, and the pursuit of freedom. And my work problematizes this binary, a starting point for which was my essay, The Environment as Freedom, a Decolonial Reimagining. So I'll leave that there in terms of what fundamentally moves me, and I'd be happy to talk more about this later on.
Well, thank you so much. And yes, there's a lot we want to dive into there. Lena, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. Hi, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Malini. Thanks, Lama Foundation. I am honored to be here to discuss this profound topic that is so close to my heart and has so many different lenses that I continue to try to learn and unlearn around. I'm grateful to the Lama Foundation for hosting this work. I'm grateful to Paul, who's been engaging folks around this work and these questions for years. And I still feel fairly new to this work. Right now, today, I am coming to you from around the mid-coast, Maine. I'm up here visiting some family. And these lands are occupied lands. As a white person in New England, I am continually trying to unlearn and relearn the colonist history that we live within. And this land was the land of the Wawanak, who still live here in this area. This land was stolen and expropriated. And the more we, as colonizing folks, realize that role and how that has this place in history and how we need to first start paying attention to that, and then next start really undoing the history of colonization that has created the environmental disasters that we see around us, and the justice disasters that we see around us. And I really try to come at this work from a place of humility. I came into this field through loving nature. I used to say I don't really care about the people, I just care about the environment. And then I started realizing that what I cared about was the vulnerable people, the vulnerable species, the more than human species in the environment, the vulnerable people. And that has been a real driving force for me. So I started in this work as a forest ecologist and an outdoor adventurer, a geologist as an undergrad who just loved nature, and then started becoming an outdoor guide. And I found my way into a contemplative sea kayaking meditation retreat, some sea kayaking meditation retreat work that was the first time that I ever combined contemplative practices with paying attention to the environment and the condition of the environments of our world, and then who that impacts. And that was pretty early on for me, about 20 years ago. And over the past 20 years, I've been an outdoor guide, I've been a teacher, and then I became a forest ecologist. I've always loved nature and wanted to understand it, and increasingly have wanted to understand the role of humanity and humans in it. And so long, my education was focused on the last few hundred years of colonizing humans and that role. And that was always hard to grapple with, to sort of realize the massive destruction. And in my last several years, I have been moved by contemplative practices. It might sound sort of cheesy, but I found my way into meditation through some stuff in my personal life. And I had this moment when I was practicing metta meditation, which is a loving kindness meditation that practices putting your heart and love towards all beings on the planet. And I was sitting and doing that in this climate controlled room, and had this real moment of moral responsibility, realizing that here I was trying to care for the world while consuming resources to make it comfortable while I was thinking about that. And I've been sort of trying to figure out how to walk that path, driven to address the wrongs that I see more clearly when I meditate. And then I've been trying to bring that to my students. So for the past 6 or 7 years, I've been bringing my introductory environmental classes that I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst to meditate and contemplate at this intersection of the environment, us as humans, the role of humans, and the reality of environmental injustice. And as Malini says, environmental unfreedoms nationally in our country and globally, and with a particular lens on Indigenous communities who suffer so deeply from problems caused by the consumption of colonizing nations. And there's lots more to dig into there. But I find myself constantly learning, constantly self-reflecting, and trying to walk with the moral responsibility that I want to feel like I hold.
Okay, thank you so much. These issues that we're struggling with, that have to do with sort of environmental harm and social injustice and so forth. I mean, I think they really do test like who we are basically and how we walk through this world. I want to talk at some point about the existential dimensions of that, but I want to drill a little bit more into the justice piece, because both of you spoke of how important that is to you. And I would say, I'm old, I'm 100 years old. No, actually not 100 years old, but I'm old. And so I was part of the environmental movement fairly early on, where it used to be pretty much a green movement, a movement concerned with the more than human world rather than just the human world. And luckily over time, I think the movement has evolved so that today it's basically, it's sort of, it's inextricable, this connection between justice and environmental well-being. And the climate movement today is a climate justice movement. It's not simply a climate movement. But I wondered if you could talk about that intersection, because that intersection, on the one hand, it can map on fairly well, and on the other hand, there's tensions there. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the connections between justice and environmental well-being. What are the features that you think are most relevant there? And feel free to talk about your own work and how you enlist justice in it. So Malini, maybe I'll turn back to you if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, I think in tracing the history of environmentalism and noting that, more recently, justice has become inextricable for environmental concerns, I think you have to ask the questions, which environmental history are you tracing, right? So if you're talking about the mainstream environmental movement that, a lot of white people often peg to the publication of Rachel Carson's book, then sure, it's only more recently that social justice has become an inextricable concern, pushed in large part because people of color activists demanded inclusion. They demanded that, so-called quotidian and ordinary environments, and not just the great wild open wilderness, are also equally thought about, right, as environments that need to be, rightly considered within the gamut of a more capacious notion of environment. And so for me, I think to a certain extent, indigenous land right movements, Chicanx farm worker movements, Black labor movements, and more far afield Adivasi or indigenous insurrections against land and mineral grabs in central India, right? These have always been subaltern movements that are environmental and resource focused, but are also about justice, right? And so I think we have to think about those longer histories that might have been written out of the green so-called mainstream environmental movement, right? And so for me, it's instructive, therefore, to trace how these lineages of social justice have always, to some extent, been wrapped up, right, in the defense of land, in the defense of water, right? And so one of the most important intersections, since you asked about some of these areas where the so-called social justice realm comes together with the environment, is labor. I mean, I really think that we've forgotten in the United States how, the fight for standards, for protection against pesticides, for occupational safety, that Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting with the Memphis sanitation workers, right? Those were questions of labor. And often those most dehumanized by capitalist labor regimes, right, are also those who are involved in environmental production or sort of really close to resources or infrastructures that we depend on, right? And so for me, labor and environment is a really important intersection. The other, and of course, this really speaks to my own interest theoretically, is the link between property and in the environment, right? And the ways in which property rights, right, and the primitive accumulation, the ways in which people were thrown off of the commons, that's really kind of wrapped up in the history of capitalism, was also very much about resources, right? And so, social justice scholars, Marxist scholars are very articulate and specific about sort of, the problems of property, but I think those are very indelibly tied to the environment and kind of pushing back against propertizing is then commoning, right? The push to make resources available and accessible, for groups that obviously are most closely and actually steward those resources. So labor on the one hand, property on the other are really important intersections and have always been, this is really the point I want to drive home, have to some extent always been wrapped up with the environment, with struggles for and with the environment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, actually. Lena, tell us about justice and how you situate yourself? I mean, how your work deals with it.
Yeah, I think I try to learn and then I try to share with students. There's so much here, and what Malini, everything you just said resonated so profoundly. It comes down to land and resources and labor, and that's what created this history that we have, that our country is not paying attention to, that our educational system is not allowing to be taught in certain states. We have this history of stealing land and of forcing labor that has created this culture that considers the environment and those vulnerable in it as disposable in the race for money and in the support of capitalism, the unquestioned capitalism. And what I find in my teaching is that there's been such a devoid of critical view of that in our culture. Students aren't often taught to step out and look at that big picture, and it can be really daunting. And so one of the places where I've been really finding the contemplative component of teaching to allow students to really hold some of these realities that we might have heard about, like a lot of us have like, oh yeah, I know about climate change. Oh yeah, I know that that's disproportionately impacting the people who aren't causing it the most, or disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable, disproportionately impacting those who have suffered the most oppression historically. And yet, without sitting with it emotionally and noticing our internal emotional reaction and grappling with how in contrast that is to our own values and principles, I believe there's a lot of motivating force there, because I think we live in a culture that really perpetuates itself by lack of self-perspective. And I find the contemplative practices, whether it's meditation or reflection, deep listening, all of these practices can help us to pay attention in a way that we've been trained not to, and to hold the pain that is caused by this, that we've often learned to emotionally survive by sort of turning off and giving the space and time to hold that pain, feel it, and let ourselves see our own power in this culture and our potential role to increase conversation about the injustice around us, the history of injustice, and the possibility of real systematic change, the great turning. And it's so key to notice the lack of voices in this and to begin to decenter white voices. And I find this so tricky as a white person who like really wants to dig into this, because I really feel like I want to do more listening than talking these days. So on that note, I'm gonna stop talking right now, but there's so much work to be done. And I feel like humility and coming at these issues with a sense of humility and an emotional openness can really help, has really helped me. And I've seen it happen with some of my students, to sort of find our inner motivation that is often just sort of, there's an apathetic wall that we often need to fight in folks. I would say in students, because that's who I work with the most, but I think it's in people. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I wonder if we could, with this conversation, provide a little more detail to it, provide a little instance of, I know both of you have studied instances of environmental injustice. And I wonder, just for people on the webinar tonight, if we could just, we don't go into super detail, but what does it mean when we say that, caste and class and race cause disproportional vulnerabilities? Or, most of the ways we think about this is the people least responsible are on the receiving end disproportionately. But how can you provide a little more examples or things that, or examples that you care about that have sort of helped you develop this way of thinking? And since we have a rhythm here, Malini, if you don't mind, keep going first. Is that cool?
Yeah. So I think the most helpful would be to give examples from my research. So, for instance, in many cities of the global South, many urban dwellers reside in informal settlements, right, which run the gambit from slums, which is kind of a generic and more of a narrative term, not really a legally fixed term, but to describe basically settlements that are shoddily constructed, don't have formal infrastructure, and which the state really sort of designates as a problem, right, in terms of housing. All the way to sort of more elite informal settlements or informal areas where middle class groups live. And what I've looked at here is the ways in which environmental harms, in particular water access and flooding, are distributed within informal settlements, and how it is often wealthier groups who have access to state power, even though they are living in informal settlements, they aren't criminalized to the extent that slums are, and slums are denied water access or are made to pay exorbitant prices through private water networks. And so that's an example of a kind of injustice. And what happens is the kind of social marginalization of slums is very layered. So of course, economically, weaker sections, which is the state category, and then usually caste minorities or Muslims, right? So a lot of Muslims are kind of considered, are ostracized and have no recourse to housing, and so have to go live in informal settlements. So there's layer upon layer of discrimination that then results in an environmental injustice, such as the denial of access to water. In Washington, D.C., I have been doing oral histories and environmental histories of the Kenilworth area of Ward 7 across the Anacostia River. And unbeknownst to many of our colleagues at American University, one of the nation's largest open burning incinerators, the Kenilworth incinerator in the landfill, was located in 1948, right next to a middle-class Black housing development called Mayfair Mansions, which plummeted the housing values, right? So it's actually one of the most blatant examples of environmental racism, where a trash incinerator, which then became a landfill, Kenilworth, was placed, right? So the location of toxic waste sites, right, has a direct bearing on property values and people's health in the area. So that's a very blatant case of environmental racism, because often these sites were placed in minority neighborhoods, as is very well known by the environmental justice community in the United States. So these are two different kinds of environmental harms. One structured by legal designation or housing designation and caste and class and religion, and the other designated by race and kind of location of a toxic waste dump. And I would say those are sort of very, very clear examples, but also differ.
Yeah, okay, good. Lena, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, Malini, those were two very profound and really classic examples. The locating of toxic waste dumps, oil refineries, all kinds of environmentally degrading industrial complexes is, if you just look at the research and maps about there, it is disproportionately in areas with people of color and communities that are the most vulnerable, the least politically and financially enfranchised, and often are already very clearly suffering the most health effects. And when I start looking at those realities directly, I feel sick to my stomach unless I start figuring out what I can do. And I often find students feel like they can't do anything, and often that feels like a freezing knowledge. And so what I've been trying to do is try to transform that into action. And other kinds of examples of environmental racism. I actually invite my students to go and do research and find different examples and share them, because once you start looking, you start realizing there are unlimited thousands upon thousands and thousands of examples. And it just depends on how sort of focused you become. But other examples, you know, we're about to have one of the first hurricanes of the season is going to hit South Florida. And, you know, the rich folks will be fine. And the poor and the vulnerable will not. And climate change is increasing the intensity and the relative density of these storms. They're happening more frequently and are continuously impacting the most vulnerable. So we have these sort of very obvious locations of all of these destructive industries. And then we also have these increased numbers of environmental disasters that are really disproportionately affecting those who can't adapt to that change in the same kind of way. And when we start really looking at the coastal communities that are impacted, you know, one of the communities that I first started learning about is the South Pacific island country of Kiribati. Where the land, the amount of land lost already with the increase in sea level is already taking away people's homes and land and travel routes. And, you know, with an island nation with a max elevation of a couple meters, as just one example of many island nations in the South Pacific. Dominantly, you know, communities of color, communities that don't have somewhere to go. And we're creating these climate refugees in this global community with increasing populations, where it's going to be hard to, going to be hard. Like that. I failed to find the words that will really reflect the rage that I feel when I start looking at this directly, because it's so massively unjust and honestly remarkably underknown. And when we're looking at things like, you know, whether it's consumption, I was just visiting with a friend at her housing complex, and while we were sitting there, it was a 90-degree day. We were sitting in the shade talking, and there was someone going around with a leaf blower, just blowing leafless grass the entire time. With, you know, the gas-powered leaf blower, you know, and this is a silly example, but it was one of those things that just shows how mindlessly our culture defaults to using electricity and gas-powered everything, and that transition that we've known for decades that we have to make, or it's going to lead to certain death, whether it's of humans or more than human species. We have you know, the UN conservation of diversity of species estimates up to 150 species going extinct every day. And meanwhile, we're using fossil fuels to blow leaves around. You know, like there needs to be a serious reckoning. And I have come from the firm belief that if enough of us let ourselves look deeply and open our hearts, it feels impossible to not start changing. And it just feels very clear that we got to do something. And what's it going to take? For me, I get a lot of energy and motivation to become an activist, to make personal changes, to try to push for grassroots political changes when I open my heart to that pain, and that I feel like our culture is constantly trying to not pay attention to with distraction. And I'm not perfect, you know, I'm still trying to figure this out. We're going at this like, you know, too little, too late, and too much to do, but I got to do something. And since I'm not really a researcher in the same way Molly is, you know, I love those examples of these really specific case studies. I find can be really eye-opening and heart-reaching in a way that can lead to change when we start paying attention to it. But we live in a world right now where, you know, we're arguing about teaching the true history of race in our country as like a national discussion, which seems insane. So there's just a lot to do. And I feel like we got to figure out how to do it with open hearts and fighting for this with love. So much of it, I feel like, comes down to like really walking a walk that we feel proud of. Because when we look at what we're doing, it's hard to feel proud of it. I think I sort of just took that down as sort of root, but at that intersection, that's sort of where I keep coming back to.
Great. Well, let me just say, Lena, you are perfect. Really. But I do want to, I want to take this a little further. First of all, thank you for also expanding this notion of justice and including interspecies justice as well, because that is a dimension. And then when we add that onto these already sort of monumental injustices between humans and so forth, I just wonder about this connection between knowledge and response, or knowledge and action. You say so much to do. You know, in my classes, one thing I do is I have students collect their trash for a week and then trace where it's going to go, and do this kind of sociological look at sort of where trash is generated and where it ends up. And often it is along environmental justice lines. We can actually, you know, we know that the #1 indicator of where toxic waste dumps are is skin color. And so we do this in class, and then I have them, but then I don't know what to do next. Like, okay, so this knowledge kind of bubbles up. I mean, one thing I have them do is I have them write a letter to the recipients of this, and that plays a little bit with emotions and so forth. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the transition, and maybe I'm making this dualistic and that's not helpful, but the relationship between knowledge and action. Is there a politics of knowledge that you see yourselves engaged in, which I totally hear? And can you speak of how you sort of make that transition for yourself, for your students, for your readers, and for those of us who are listening right now? Malini, I'll give you a break. Why don't we turn to Lena a little bit, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, that knowledge into action, because I think we all sort of hold well, maybe not we all, but a lot of us are struggling with holding this weight of this knowledge, and also feeling like, how much bandwidth do I have? How much energy do I have? We're stuck in these realities of work and life and home and caring for children and all of the demands that go with that. It feels so natural to slip into just getting through each day. And I think that's okay. I think we have to balance that, and that's part of sort of developing our own resilience. And that's part of my own practice, is trying to also be forgiving when I need space to sort of develop, re-enhance my buffer zone, my energy for this work. But yeah, that disconnect between knowledge and action. And so one of the people that I find a lot of inspiration from is Joanna Macy and some of her work. She has this wonderful series of sort of reflective questions that help us to walk through sort of how do I want the world to change? What am I doing to impact that? What am I doing today? What am I going to do this week? What do I commit to doing for the next year? Whatever it is. And with my students, what I try to do is encourage them to sort of see where they're at, see where they want to go, and figure out how to get there in a reasonable way. Like I actually have an assignment this past year, as I was trying to figure out sort of what to do while we're all teaching remotely during this time, where I had a project where they could buy into different sort of sustainability shifts in their own lives. And so if they were full-on meat eaters, it was, like, could you go, meatless Mondays, or weekday veg, or try being vegetarian for a week, or try being vegan for a week. And it was inevitable that those who took baby steps were more successful and had longer term progress. And, it's not as simple as like personal change, but starting to realize sort of how our daily choices, whether or not they're in alignment with our personal values and the choices we want to be making. So often I feel like the first thing is taking that sort of outside knowledge, which is like, oh, I know that beef can be, have negative impacts on the environment, and it depends on where you get it from. But like, I love this cheeseburger, so I'm going to go ahead and eat it. To sort of stepping out and thinking like, wait, do I want to be walking that walk? Or do I want to be walking this walk? And you know, no one's going to be 100% of the time, but starting to have space to pay attention, and even just space to begin to articulate our own values. You know, we don't do that much in life. You know, we learn the Pythagorean theorem and photosynthesis and all these other things in school, but so infrequently are we offered the opportunity to articulate our own values and how we're actually supporting them or not supporting them in any given day. And I find that it can be pretty profound when we start realizing that what we're actually doing isn't in alignment with what we mean to be doing. So I find that attention at that intersection can help shift from knowledge to action. And that action can be all kinds of things. It can be showing up to marches in DC. It can be beginning to shift how you eat and how you think on a daily basis, and lots of things in between. But beginning to pay attention, I feel like, is a pretty key step. And that's one of the things that I continually try to sort of paying attention with humility. And then trying to walk the walk that makes us feel proud of ourselves. And we're not always going to do it right, because we live in a culture that is really, you know, defaulting to lots of things that are hard to feel proud of when you look at them directly and consider them with an open heart and an impact on others. And man, when I stop meditating regularly, I notice it, because I don't hold it as hard, because making space for that can be important. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Malini?
Yeah, I really liked what you said, Lena, about action coming in different forms. And one of the things I try to do is take students out of their comfort zones of individualism and thinking that, you know, recycling their bottle that they're drinking from right now or eating less meat, you know, alone is sort of enough. And to really, as you said, pay attention to collective struggle and, you know, histories of collective struggle. So I want to introduce listeners to a concept that I find very helpful when I teach on meaningful change and sort of theory building for meaningful change in environmental justice. And that's Edgar Peterse's, who's a South African intellectual's concept of radical incrementalism, which is a dialectic, right? It brings together two opposing terms. But the idea is that while keeping your sights on longer term radical systemic overhaul change, right? You know, what Naomi Klein is sort of referred to as this changes everything, right? Keeping your sights on that. It's the sort of strategic, of course, also bite-sized forms of change that is, you know, accreting and working towards that larger radical change that you also have to persist with. And abolitionists have recently referred to this as non-reformist reforms, right? Reforms that are not just reinforcing the police state and surveillance mechanisms, that are not just paying, police sort of more and beefing up the police infrastructure, but that are actually working towards shifting resources from infrastructures of death and punishment to infrastructures of life and care, right? And so the idea that there is a non-reformist reformism is, to me, Paul, a way to move from theory building and knowledge to action. And you know, I mean, sort of let's not fool ourselves. I mean, academics, of course, are really good at cultivating knowledge, but there are people who are working every day at change in collective ways, and they're working at change at that sweet spot intersection between radicalism and incrementalism, knowing that these smaller actions, you know, whether it has to do with insurgent journalism, with pushing institutions to divest, with redirecting resources, with also transformative justice and kind of de-escalation in communities, that try to avert the need for intervention by police in the carceral state. And again, I actually did this talk on the parallels between the abolition movement and climate justice, and this divest, invest, just transitions, ethics of care, all of these things infuse the movement against the carceral state as it does the movement against the fossil fuel industrial complex, the prison industrial complex on the one hand, the fossil fuel industrial complex on the other. And so what I try to do is I take students out of that comfort zone of individualism and atomism, and I introduce them to these collective histories, and I have them do a theory of change podcast, because of course the young uns are so good and with technology, and that is their language that they communicate in, and I have them go out and find change makers, and who can be defined again in this broad way of change, is not just policy or advocacy that we try to insist upon at a place like SIS, but is actually comes in many avatars, including education, including faith-based institutions. So one of my students interviewed a preacher actually who had dedicated his life to justice, and really tried to think about like the ways in which justice infuses his faith-based activism around homelessness in particular. Mana House was the name of the organization. So I have them interview We Act and other organizations that are focused more traditionally on environmental justice, and then come up with, so what was this person or organization's theory of change? And that's one of their final assignments in my class. And so for me, that is them being, intellectuals that help us translate knowledge into action, and they're learning from these action-oriented agents, and they're also themselves then thinking about theories of change and praxis of change.
So thank you. I have many more questions, but I also want to open the conversation up to some other voices. And so, excuse me, we have a few questions already asked, and I'll just invite listeners to pose more in the Q&A icon. But there's one that the question that's been, the first question that's actually been asked speaks to what we're talking about, I think, in a direct way. I'm just going to read the question. And so the asker, it's Jupang, asks, I'm particularly interested in diverse and sometimes conflicting ideas of justice. Some folks working in multi-species justice ask about whether multi-species justice is possible within a colonial framework of justice. Could the speakers talk about how you see the tensions between reform? This is exactly what you spoke of, but could the speakers talk about how you see the tensions between a reformist idea of justice versus an anti-colonial justice? And so Malini, you spoke about sort of radical incrementalism, and you've spoken to that a little bit. I wondered if you could sort of put this in a sort of anti-colonial frame a little bit for us, and ask the question about how do we, you in fact said that you have this internal compass a little bit, and that you're motivated in that way. And how do we trust our compass to not basically reproduce, because in fact, even if we just sort of focus, and I love, Lena, the concept of, our own values, and we also know that those values are instrumentalized through us. And so how do we trust this? And if you could speak about these efforts within a anti-colonial justice orientation, that would be really helpful. And I'll leave it, who would like to go first? You're both too humble, I think.
Well, I can start. There's actually a great piece that I teach on towards a decolonial environmental justice, a Latin American perspective. And it's by Alvarez and Kulasset, and it's a really thought-provoking piece, because it takes to task the American environmental justice movement for being over-reliant on liberal legalism, and sort of this notion that the law and the state, can deliver redress and justice. And it also takes to task the classically liberal Rawlsian notion of distributional justice, right? This idea that environmental harms have to be somehow equally distributed, and so I think that justice, like any lofty concept, freedom, rights, etc., nation is subject to differing interpretations and different political imperatives. And so for me, the conversation around an anti-colonial or decolonial justice, I think, first of all, moves away from Eurocentric conceptions of the state or the courts, right, being kind of the ultimate arbiter of equality, justice, fraternity, and really thinks about how do we seek justice through alternative routes of redress. So that's one kind of major insight of the decolonial literature. The other is, I think this is interesting too. It's moving away from sort of a paternalistic, patronizing notion, and this is where I myself, I think, have really had to auto-critique and think about the ways in which perhaps my own privilege was then refracting the notions of justice that I had, moving away from this notion that you have to sort of, give voice to the voiceless or work on behalf of the marginalized. And the indigenous thinker Leanne Beta-Somosake Simpson, in her book As We Have Always Done, really kind of pushes against this white saviorism, right? This idea that in the particular context that she's writing, of white Canadians, having this saviorism complex as far as the indigenous groups go, but thinking about, accomplishment, allyship, solidarity, right? That's ultimately what it would be to re-envision humanism and therefore justice, right? Is not this one-way flow. I think here's where Lena's insistence on humility really matters for how we conceptualize justice, right? Again, not as a charity, but as an act of radical solidarity. So those are two different ways that I think decolonial approaches embed, kind of a decentering of the state and state-centeredness, A, and B, a move from charity and paternalism to radical solidarity.
Thanks, Lena.
Yeah, awesome. I was struck by the multi-species component of that question, and Haiju Pong, how are you? I'd love to talk more. So yeah, the multi-species piece is really interesting. When you start thinking about land and the destruction of land, so easy, it's so often so straightforward to think that everybody's being sort of equally impacted in these ways. But then you come up against these certain circumstances, vulnerable humans who are at risk of mosquitoes, and then the mosquitoes and the value of the mosquitoes themselves and their existence. And then, how do we prioritize? And I've started seeing hierarchies as I work on decolonizing my own mind and trying to work with that humility and practice understanding, just like we were saying, Paul, like my values, where do my values come from? And I'm in this colonized world and I come from this colonist culture, and I'm trying to start to learn to rethink those from these different perspectives. And as I start looking at the sort of impact of colonization everywhere and in every aspect of life in New England, it becomes really apparent that there's these hierarchies in every direction, and there's these implied different value systems for different groups. And when I try to think about sort of how to address justice, first I try to work on seeing injustice, and seeing where it exists and how it exists, and whether we are by default just valuing humans above all other species. And I might have been hearing that lens of that question wrong, but that's sort of where I was sitting with that. And in Buddhism, one of the precepts is not harming others. And to sit with that while a mosquito is biting you and trying to decide what to do about it, and realizing that, why is that mosquito so much more valuable or so much less valuable than a butterfly or a koala or a chimpanzee or a human? and start to step out and sort of realize just how colonized that mindset is of the hierarchy of these different species and their value. And all the mosquito zappers out there just remind me of that default way of thinking. And there's a lot of unlearning that we all need. I think I first heard the word decolonization at a contemplative Association for Contemplative Mind and Higher Education conference years ago. And I sort of felt my body stop in its tracks and just was like, I need to understand that more. And I feel like I'm going to be working to understand what that word means for the rest of my life, and trying to figure out how to change how that impacts justice and my view of justice. And I think this is a fascinating question, and I feel like I have a bunch of unfinished thoughts on it, but it's a great question, and I think it's one we should keep on holding, is like, justice for who?
Can I tell a story, Paul? It's very quick.
Sure.
Because you said something that made me chuckle. In 1999, I heard the Dalai Lama speak in Delhi, in India, and he said, Lena, I try to practice nonviolence to all species except the mosquito. When I see a mosquito, I catch it and I kill it. And he did that in front of like the whole audience, and then burst out laughing. Or like, okay, if the Dalai Lama is doing that, it means we can all do it.
I appreciate that. And I sort of had a little thing in my head, well, except ticks. Mosquitoes I can still find some love for. Ticks I struggle with. But I appreciate that story. And the Dalai Lama.
Well, I think you're both underlining just that we are humans, and we have our frailties and our abilities, and while you are perfect, we also have a lot of work to do, and so and a lot of clarity that we have to develop. I want to invite there's two questions that have shown up that you say, Lena, this is a tough question and we should revisit and so forth. I want to revisit it again through two other voices that came on the questions. And one's from Aaron Godlansky. I'm not pronouncing that right, sorry, Aaron. But Aaron asked a really interesting question. He said, given the issues with reliance on the legal/state actors to promote environmental justice, what are your thoughts on the role of militant environmentalism, deep green resistance, Earth First, and so forth? Can we be militant and contemplative? He asks, can we blow up a dam with love? No, can you blow up a dam out of love? Is that possible? And I'm going to just add another question to this, because Adam Fink asked something similar, and I'll just ask you guys to pull these together. Adam asks, as a current student, I often find it very frustrating being able to only create very small and minute changes in my community. What strategies have you found to be effective in creating deep, meaningful change that cultivates environmental and racial justice? Is there a different framework for change making on a micro versus macro scale? So those are deep, big questions, and they are revolving around this topic that we keep wrestling with. And if either of these questions sort of inspire you to say something else, we'd love to hear it. Malini, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, the question on militant struggles and armed insurrections, I think, is just so fascinating, and I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of India's Hindu nationalist government and its oppression of indigenous and Dalit struggles, and the fact that it's been particularly brutal in suppressing Maoist insurrections in India, basically for the defense of natural resources and land, right? Which, because the corporate state nexus has mined the heck out of natural resources, has done massive land grabs and takeovers of indigenous land and forests. And so, Frantz Fanon, a Martinican philosopher, of anti-colonial thought, said, violence is often the language of those of last resort. And many people say, oh, Frantz Fanon advocated violence, right? Then that's what he's pegged to. But he equally advocated a new humanism, and a humanism made to the measure of the world, that where there is this this very conscious dismantling of structures of colonialism and racism, so as to enable people to be human to the fullest extent, and be considered as human. And so, I think the question of violence, so to me, the question of violence is a very important one and has no easy answers. And we have to be very wary of the liberal narrative that violence is bad, and that people are dubbed as rioters. And obviously blowing up a dam is a large scale action, and you would hope that people are not killed in that process, because I think that would be antithetical to the demands of militant groups as well. But I think we just have to approach that question with a lot of nuance. And I know that that's where this question is coming from, and I appreciate it, because there's no binary between violence bad and reformism good at all. And if anything, the history of struggle and the history of ongoing struggle has taught us that as soon as someone starts dubbing someone else violent, right, it establishes a power relationship that can be quite criminalizing and dehumanizing. So anyway, I'll leave it at a more open-ended. I'll let Lena answer, and then I did want to answer the other question on what strategies have you found to be effective. But maybe, Lena, do you have a comment? Because I know the comment around love was specifically directed at you.
Yeah, and it's so tricky. I appreciated all of what you just said, Malini. Yeah, and I definitely went straight towards, sort of imagining the downstream impact of a explosively destroyed dam and the potential impacts on human life and the more than human species, and then stepping out from that and thinking about the impact of that dam on human life and the more than human species and the aquatic migrating species that historically have lived in so many of our rivers that have been part of the extinction waves because they can't, our dams have created lack of passage for migrating species and caused huge amounts. I mean, often when a dam has been put in, it has been, at least globally, displacing indigenous and vulnerable folks. And stepping out from that and thinking about sort of the potential negative impact of not doing it versus the negative impact of doing it becomes a really, an issue of a real deep question of morals and values and contemplative. And I would sit with that for a long time. The non-violent direct action, I feel like there's so much potential that can be done within the non-violent direct action world that is not as maximally utilized as it could be. But I also sort of feel like I'm going there because it feels like a safer answer. There's something a little scary about being like, yeah, blow up that dam. Like, whoa, I can't say that. And I think that there has been some amazing work done by amazing activists doing nonviolent direct action that has had real positive influences. Even one of my first years at the University of Massachusetts, I witnessed amazing grassroots action from students that through nonviolent direct action, and often, there were a bunch of students who got arrested during the sit-ins to force UMass to divest. Yeah, it did take students being arrested on the line, and I feel like that can be its own level of risk, but there is this whole spectrum, and I think anything that is militant just needs to be, I often think there is love involved, but it is terrifying to speak to because they can go so bad. but then we also see how bad things are going without the kind of change that needs to be happening. And that's where we get into that macro micro question that Adam asked. I think a lot of people lose faith in action when they see it having such a minimal impact on saving the world, on wanting to save this world with love, and that can lead to a lot of frustration and either apathy or potentially more militant engagement. I think there's this question of hope that gets into the conversation, because I feel like small actions that don't feel like they go anywhere can start to lead to a feeling of hopelessness. And I see a lot of feelings of hopelessness among students. And I'm curious to see what you have to say to this, Malini, but the great turning that needs to happen is going to be a combination of everybody who cares, realizing they care, realizing what they need to do with that, and then really joining forces. And I personally feel like the big action is going to come from groups of people really collaborating in a way that's going to become increasingly clearly obvious. There's this quote. Is it okay if I read a quote, Paul? All right. I'm gonna read this quickly, but this is a quote that I often turn to around this issue. And this is a quote from Václav Havel, the former president of Czechoslovakia, about hope. Hope is a state of mind, not of the world. Either we have hope or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul, and it's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. It is an orientation of the spirit and orientation of the heart, love. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is not the same as joy that things are going well, or a willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it has a chance to succeed. Hope is definitely not the same as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. And when I feel like everything I'm doing is going nowhere, I kind of turn back to that, because I feel like I still have to keep doing it without knowing where it's going to go. And I often feel like as a teacher, I feel like to these tiny things, I don't know where they go. And there's some faith in that. I'll pass it to you now, Malini.
Yeah, thanks for that great quote. I want to hat tip to John's comment in the Q&A that dams themselves are ongoing forms of violence. And I think this is really, really important to keep in mind, right? The mass displacement that has gone into dam building in many places, and also the ways in which we call certain things violence and don't call other things violence, right? So the fact that the sort of financial speculation, the ways in which bankers kind of make a lot of money off of people losing their homes is not considered violence, whereas other things are called violence. It's the same way in which crime is socially constructed. So I think it's just, I think it's a really, really important question that gets at our categories, right, of what we call violence and not violence, and what we call crime and not crime. And so, anyway, I just think John's point is really helpful. On to Adam's question about change. You know, over the last year, I think that a practice that I'm seeing, especially in these types of Zoom webinars, is for people to list organizations that they've been donating money to, right? So it's sort of like fight fire with fire in a moneyed society. How can we then move money, you know, and move our money to places where we'd rather have it be invested, or you know, contribute to, right? So whether it's Critical Resistance that's doing really incredible non-reformist reforms work on abolition in prisons, whether it's We Act in Harlem and their very wide-ranging environmental justice work, you know, whether it's indigenous activists, I think there's no shortage, unfortunately, of places that you can put your money. And I think for me, it's been really important to donate very locally in DC, to housing rights organizations, anti-gentrification organizations, to donate to anti-caste movements, you know, and sort of immediate food aid and aid around COVID in India, also mutual aid in the United States. And so, I mean, I know, again, this returns to the sort of charity conceptions of justice. And I think there's always that slippery slope there. And so I want to acknowledge that it's not a sort of, it's not a foolproof way, obviously, but I do think that there is this renewed sense of the sort of sharing economy and the redistributional, you know, kind of ethic that has to be practiced, and kind of in a mass way, right? Not just philanthropies dictating, but really kind of mass people power, making small donations. That I think is one way that we haven't mentioned so far, that I think can speak to this feeling of feeling powerless and wanting to make change, you know, in bigger ways.
So actually that comment connects up with a question that came from Chris Nelson a while ago. We've been talking about sort of individual action, collective action. What's that relationship? I'm reminded that when Bill McKibben, who will be here next week, when he's often asked, what can an individual do to make a difference? He said the best thing an individual could do is stop being an individual and sort of start to recognize not just our interdependence with you know, the earth itself, but with each other. And when you were speaking of sort of mobilization, I think, so I'd like to ask Chris's question, which is in relation to the question about the connection between knowledge and action. I'm curious for your thoughts about how the presence of community supports our individual actions. So where does community come into, and especially in a world where communities are constantly being broken apart, fragmented, and it's hard to feel like, what community am I part of? So if you could speak a little bit about to the communal piece of this, that would be really helpful. You're shaking your head, Lena, so maybe I'll start with you.
All right, I was going in, but then I saw Malini on mute, so I was backing off. Yeah, you know, we live in a culture that is so devoid of community, and you know, that is very much focused on the individual. And as I've been trying to learn to understand the decolonizing, it becomes increasingly clear just how much that is a colonizer mindset, that individuality and the lack of community. And it almost makes it feel like a act of resistance to develop community and to work with community in righteous directions, and directions that will really transform our world in the change that needs to happen. That being said, so often at this point, you know, people create their own community and find their own communities, whether it's through religious communities or school communities or clubs or, you know, all kinds of things. I have folks that have found their community through friend groups that have become like family. I know folks whose community come through Alcoholics Anonymous or through their local chapters of various outdoorsing groups. I feel like we are now in a situation where we have to create our own community and find our communities and find the communities that feed our strength and feed our soul and feed our engagement. You know, it's important to notice how our communities either give us strength or take our strength, and to maintain an understanding of what our actual communities are. You know, even just taking a moment right now and thinking, like, you know, I'll just ask everybody in the audience, just think about who your communities are. What are the communities that support you? What are the communities that might take away your energy? You know, sometimes family can be a great source of support and strength and engagement in our world. And sometimes it can really be a source of stress and anxiety and responsibility and need for giving care and everywhere in between, and lots of different variations. So I think community is incredibly important, and finding a community that feeds our energy for this work and noticing that is incredibly important. But I think it also is rare and needs to be intentional. Yeah. Malini?
Yeah, I think I have a set of different communities. I think foremost over the last decade or so, apart from my family, of course, has been a kind of radical scholarly community that has, unwaveringly told me, don't wait until tenure to speak up, right? There's this whole notion that somehow tenure gives you, more security to speak up. But if you haven't spoken up since till then, you're not going to after that. And so that encouragement to try to make the university space a more welcoming space, for those who have traditionally been underrepresented in academia, to use my privilege and voice and ability and positioning to then be able to build something in the space of the university, but also across academia, has been kind of my community over one of my primary communities of folks working on anti-racism, on environmental justice, but also in post-colonial and decolonial studies. So folks who are not scared of also having a very normative and ethical stance around justice, right? There's this notion of impartiality, which is, of course, itself a political stance, right, in academia. But those who who really own who they are writing with and for, in solidarity with and for, and so to me, just helping me find my voice through that scholarly community has been really, really helpful. And then, I'm now sort of trying to build actually a community around transnational solidarity struggles, especially connecting Asian American and Black African American struggles, and really trying to think about sort of shared histories of civil rights movements also. And that space is really exciting to me because it's really in the making, it's becoming. And it's resurrecting mid-20th century anti-colonial and civil rights histories, right? Where at the same time that Pan-Africanism and African and Asian decolonizing struggles are happening, there was the Black Panthers movement, civil rights movement in the US. And so at this moment in the George Floyd aftermath and that sort of reckoning that happened around the world, I think there's a conversation around those idioms of transnational solidarity that I'm really excited about. And I'm writing about it, I'm in conversation, I'm often invited on panels. And so that to me, the anti-racist solidarity that kind of harkens, an older tradition of civil rights activism in the 1960s, multiracial, is very exciting to me. So that's another community that I think I'm on the sort of cusp of trying to build.
Well, thank you so much. So sadly, I'm looking at the time and there's not much time left. And there's been some great questions that we won't have time to answer, but I would encourage people to look at the Q&A, and you can actually see those questions because they're quite insightful. What I'd like to do is in the next, we have like 4 minutes left. I'd like to just invite any final comments the two of you have. I know it's a hard thing to try to bring closure to such a disparate conversation on the one hand, but anything you want to leave us with, and maybe before you do, I just want to remind people who are on the call that this is part of a series, and that next week we will have a conversation about environmental activism particularly. and we'll kind of revisit some of these questions. But we'll talk today, we've talked to sort of two scholars who are scholar activists, and next time we're going to talk to two activists who also happen to kind of be scholars. And so that'll be on Tuesday, next Tuesday at 7 o'clock Eastern time. And then after that, we're going to have a workshop starting on Friday night. So look at the chat section of and you'll see links to that. But Lena and Malini, I just want to say, the one thing we know about you both is you're very generous, and I appreciate your time. But I'd love to hear any final thoughts you want to leave us with.
Well, I can start. I'll just come full circle, I think, and return to something I opened with, and also some of my writing that I dropped in the chat box here to the panelists and attendees. And to me, I think environmentalism is nothing if it isn't grounded in a conceptualization of radical humanism and the environment as freedom, the environment reimagined against life robbing and dignity robbing environmental unfreedoms. And in that essay that I dropped the link to, The Environment as Freedom, I quote historian Robin D.G. Kelly, who is a scholar based at UCLA, who writes in the foreword to Angela Davis's The Meaning of Freedom and Other Difficult Dialogues, that, quote, freedom is a process of becoming, of being able to see and understand difference within unity, and resisting the tendency to reproduce the hierarchies embedded in the world we want to change, end quote. And I think that speaks to sort of a lot of what we were trying to get at today. And so I'll just leave you with that thought, right, of how to conceptualize the environment as freedom, which is, I think is really, really orienting my compass right now. Thank you.
Lena?
Thanks, Malini. I love that internal compass perspective. Yeah. And I'm so grateful. I feel like I've learned so much from you tonight, Malini. I came at this I'm from this sort of scientific side that has sort of, I've walked this way into environmentalism, and then sort of discovering the role of anti-racism in that work, and still trying to sort of find my way in that in my teaching. And for me, so much of it comes down to love and compassion, which, when you get down to it, it is radical to hold the suffering of others. And when really practicing holding that pain honorably and honestly, I find there's deep, profound power there. And, as Malini, as you were saying, it's not, as much as I love plants and trees, it's not about the plants and the trees. It's about justice and humans, and being just fiercely compassionate for the experience of others, and conceiving of our role in this larger system, and how to really be true to ourselves, and be true to who we want to be in this world, and be true to the world itself. And I find that this is sort of lifelong work, and it all comes back to justice and historical perspectives, and sitting with an open heart and facing these realities can be a really powerful motivator. And I don't think I'll ever teach without it. And I will be constantly learning and growing, and trying to understand how to better decolonize this work and the teaching and what environmentalism truly can be. And I'm so thrilled for anybody who can be along on this path. If you're interested in digging in more, you didn't have your question answered and you want to talk more, we're also going to have a workshop in a week and a half. So check that out. And I'm always thrilled to perpetually have these conversations and learn from each other with humility and motivation. So I'll stop there, but thank you. This has been a pleasure.
Well, thanks to both of you, and thanks for those who are listening. It's time to say goodbye. God, that sounds like Mr. Rogers. But it is time to say goodbye. I'm the host. I'm going to try to figure out how to close this down. But
Thank you so
for
much
coming.
to you, Paul. Really enjoyed this conversation, and to you, Lena. I learned a lot too. And thanks to all our attendees.
Well,
Yeah, and I will say, Mr. Rogers is not a terrible person to sound like. He was a righteous, compassionate man.
All right. Well, thank you all. Okay, everybody be well, and we'll see you down the road.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Malini.
So long.
Thanks, Lama.
Yes, thanks, Lama.